So again, I wanted to extend a warm welcome to all who are joining us today. Next slide, please. Welcome to today's webinar, Program Implementation and Evaluation. This is session 3 on evaluation. This webinar is sponsored by the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC, housed at Rutgers in the School of Health Professions in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. My name is Gati. I'm the project coordinator of the center, and I'll be introducing our center today. Slide, please. The MHTTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health workforce to deliver evidence-based and promising practices to individuals with mental health conditions. We also address the full continuum of services spanning mental illness prevention, treatment, and recovery supports. And we also provide training-related workforces to people such as police, first responders, primary care providers, and vocational services to provide effective services to people with mental health conditions. We also utilize our supplemental funding to support school, teachers, and staff to address student mental health. Next slide, please. We also offer training programs on evidence-based practice, wellness and recovery, school mental health, Hispanic and Latinx mental health education, and online education courses such as Wellness Matters, IMR, Functional Thinking, and more. Next slide, please. As a reminder, all of our training programs, products, and services are available to you at no cost. Next slide, please. And if you're interested in staying up to date with the events and products that the Northeastern Korea MHTTC is providing, please sign up to receive our email communications. You can sign up on the bit.ly link provided on the screen. Next slide, please. Also, following this webinar, you'll be asked to complete a brief survey. We value this feedback and use it to improve our activities and inform our future training events. The surveys are also important because our continued funding is linked to the completion of them. So we thank you in advance for your participation. As a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded, and will be posted on our website within 7 days of this webinar broadcast. At the time of this presentation, Miriam Delphin Rittman served as Acting Assistant Secretary for Mental Health and Substance Use at SAMHSA. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement of DHHS or SAMHSA for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. We encourage you to interact with our presenter during this webinar by using the chat feature. During this webinar, you also have the capability, since it's a Zoom meeting, to unmute or mute yourself, and also the capability to control your video. So we ask that you are mindful of this during the webinar broadcast. Next slide, please. The MHTTC network is committed to using affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all of its activities. Next slide. And as a reminder, we'd like to share with you the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline for people who are experiencing suicidal ideation, mental health, or substance use crisis, experiencing emotional distress, or people concerned about someone in crisis. And now I will turn it over to Sean Karzak. He is the Assistant Research Coordinator here at our center. And again, I just want to welcome everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Kati. Hi, everybody. I'm Sean Karzak. I'm Assistant Research Coordinator at Rutgers University. I work on several research and evaluation projects in the center and the Department of Psych Rehab. So I appreciate everyone coming back. I see a lot of familiar names, and I'm glad everyone made it here today. And today's our last session of the 3 sessions we had. We talked about the planning, talked about implementation, and then today we're going to talk about evaluating our program. I'm not sure if anyone's new here, but I'm just going to give a quick recap of what we covered so far. So in the first session, we talked about the planning stage. We talked about building a planning team, assessing our program readiness, and thinking about outcomes in our data plan. And then last week, we talked about implementing our program. And we briefly talked about data collection and some outcome tools, both quantitative and qualitative data, some of the positives and negatives of each, and different ways we can collect that data. We also talked a little bit about research design, so using a before and after, so pre-post design to test whether an intervention is making a difference. We talked about using control groups and possibly even a waitlist control for our program. We talked about putting our plan to action, so the importance of open communication, which was kind of my theme last session. We talked about not only open communication from the top down, but also from the down up, so listening to our frontline staff. And we talked about informing the larger group about our project, so information about our goals and objectives, any new processes, and again, telling staff that are either directly or indirectly involved in the project. So making sure everyone's kind of informed with what's going on. And we talked about setting up for success and expecting failures, right? Inevitable that we're going to have issues come up, making sure that we support our frontline staff, whether that's new hires or existing staff, right? People might be learning a new process or unsure of their abilities in their new role. And it also just makes opportunities available for people to ask questions, gives us the opportunity to offer guidance, whether that's through supervision or trainings or meetings with the rest of our team. We talked about making on-the-fly adaptations. So sometimes things just aren't working out. So making adaptations to barriers, right? Last week in our conversation, we talked about how it's kind of hard to know when to make changes, when to kind of step in and make it happen, or when to kind of let it go. And yeah, that's a difficult question to kind of answer directly, right? It takes a little bit of weighing on how important the change might have to be. If it's critical, maybe it needs to be addressed as soon as possible. If it's something minor, maybe we can address it in our regular meetings and then kind of see how it goes from there. We also talked about how not every barrier requires the same solution, right? Taking each challenge individually to try to find an answer to each problem individually. And the last thing we talked about was some of the common barriers we might see, and some of the things that I've kind of seen in my experience. So lack of clarity, which might be around program goals or roles or responsibilities. So again, just making sure we have a strong planning phase and make sure our whole team is kind of on the same page. Talked about a lack of resources. So that could be a lack of staff, which we know is always an ongoing problem. Lack of physical resources or financial resources. So we kind of talked about making sure that we set realistic goals and realistic outcomes, and being able that we can accomplish those with what our resources are. I also talked about resistance to change, right? Change is scary. It's the staff, agencies, and stakeholders. There's a lot of different reasons, but there may be pushback for any potential reason. We want to make sure we include staff and stakeholders in our planning stage. Gives them the opportunity to voice opinions and add ideas, and ideally it'll help increase buy-in from them. And the last thing we talked about was the lack of follow-through and commitment to the project, right? So staff might feel fatigued about new initiatives, or just overall feeling burnt out, right? Sometimes it's hard to even take on a new project if you're already feeling super burnt out. We talked about how we want to make sure that the commitment comes from the top and from the leaders of the program, and follow through with our change team. So we covered a lot in our first two sessions. I just wanted to check in with everyone before we kind of moved on to some new material today. If anyone has any thoughts or questions that kind of came up that we talked about in our first two sessions. And if you do, feel free to either use the chat box or you can unmute your microphone. Again, in previous sessions, thumbs up and smiley faces in the chat are always helpful too, just to kind of see where people are at. Seeing a smiley face and not getting any questions right away. So I'm going to move on to some new stuff, new material. And if questions come up throughout, feel free to unmute and ask them. Okay, so today's agenda, we're going to talk about evaluating our program, and we're going to talk about what does it mean to evaluate our program. So examining some of our data and incorporating some observation and feedback. We'll talk about when do we do our evaluation for our programs. We'll brainstorm a little bit about what are we evaluating. We'll talk about disseminating findings. We'll talk about who and how to share what we kind of get out of our program. And we'll talk a little bit about some next steps and sustainability ideas. And then I'm hoping we have a few minutes at the end. We end a little bit early, just so we can debrief on all 3 sessions and how everything went and kind of how everyone's feeling at the end of all of them. Okay, so and just to give a little, circles back to this PDSA cycle. The first session we talked about the plan and a little bit of the do stage. Last week we talked about kind of the study and moved a little bit into the act stage. And today we're definitely going to be talking about closing out the study stage, moving to the act stage, and then kind of what the next step would be. Okay, so what is evaluation? So I think the first 2 stages, right, planning and implementing, are kind of familiar ideas. We plan to do something, then we go and do it, whether that's a project at work or just kind of doing things at home. But I think that part of that is that when we're done with something, people ask how it went, and our kind of answer is, oh, it went good. If you go to the store, I went to Target, I got some things I needed, it went good. But I think evaluating and evaluation is a little bit different than kind of what we're used to. So part of evaluating is looking at our outcomes, right? That's kind of a familiar aspect. Often for our programs, we have to provide reports for funders. We get all our data together and all the numbers we need, we send it out. We cross our fingers a little bit that we don't have any citations, but then it's kind of off our plate, right? We send it out and we have them kind of look at it. But what we do a little bit less of, critically evaluating our program. And I think it's overlooked a little bit on kind of how we got to those numbers and how we got to those outcomes. And I think that's especially true for programs that have kind of been around for a while, right? It's easy to go on autopilot and go back to business once you kind of send that information out to any funders or reporting agencies. And evaluating is really making conscious effort to think about how we're matching our services to our goals and outcomes. And how is our process of delivering services either, is it we're doing good or a bad job? And critically evaluating should be using what we learned to inform our future plans. So we kind of talked a little bit about this idea in the implementation session, right? Gathering feedback and observations, making those on the fly adaptations and kind of the short-term and quick fixes. But the results of the evaluation and going through this whole process, the idea would be to make deeper changes that may be needed. And looking at a program in a critical way. So some things that we'd want to do is analyze information about our programs, right? So that's definitely going to include some of those outcomes. And we bring up outcomes, and it's sometimes can be tiring thinking about our goals and outcomes, but really that's what drives our funding, and ultimately knowing how our clients are doing because of our program. Right, it's kind of like that measuring stick for us to kind of see how things are going and how people are doing as a result of the services we're doing. Another thing we want to look at in our evaluation is some characteristics of our program. That could be a lot of different things, but I think in thinking about demographics of our client and also the demographics of our kind of geographical area, and I think in an ongoing process that's important because that might change over time. Simple things like new housing is being built, changes in traffic, it might be easier or harder for clients to access those services. So those are things kind of outside of our control that really could change what clients that we're serving. I was, when I was making these slides, I had a pretty good, I thought it's a pretty good example. I used to work as a pizza delivery driver, and I worked at a popular pizza spot. And as all these new townhomes were being built, our deliveries that we were getting called in for were being spaced further and further out from the store. And this ended up slowing delivery times, and customers were getting kind of angry. So the owners of the restaurant had to sit down and really think about, where's the cutoff? Where's the point where we have to stop delivering to that, those further spots. So the result was that, people that were further away were then were told, hey, listen, we can't deliver there. So it's just kind of a small scale idea of, constantly monitoring how things are going and, making changes as needed. Another thing we want to look at in our evaluation is some of the activities we're providing. So the services that are being delivered overall, we might need to add or remove services that are kind of within the scope of our program. And again, when we're looking at our program, whether that's the outcomes, characteristics, or activities, the idea of evaluating all this is to make improvements and ultimately increasing the effectiveness of our program. So help us make better decisions for our program and ultimately delivering better services for our clients. Okay, so when do we do an evaluation? So we're definitely going to do an evaluation at the end of our project, right? We'll do a collective examination of all the information we have about our project and kind of doing a summary report. Right? So we might do a report internally for ourselves, but also externally for funders or stakeholders, things like that. And these may look different. So, if we're submitting an external report, we may kind of highlight our things we were doing really well, try to fluff it up a little bit, make it look good, right? We want to look good to our funders and our stakeholders and things like that. And then internally, we might, be a little bit more straightforward with ourselves and taking a deeper look about, what were our challenges and, what do we need to do to improve? So, doing a summary report, it's also good to know who your audience is and, targeting what you're highlighting in those reports. We might also do some stuff during their project, right? We talked about doing some smaller spot checks. So looking at our key metrics, right? We might just kind of check on how many clients we have in our program. What are some of the outcomes for clients? What are some of the staff feedback that we're hearing as they're working with, delivering the services? And I like to think about this as doing like an oil change, right? Having the mechanic pop the hood, check all the fluids, make sure everything's working well, right? But they're not really going in for like a deep dive to fix everything, right? They're just kind of eyeballing stuff and checking things out that they can see. In addition to the smaller spot checks, we might have to do like some mid-project evaluations. This might be monthly, every 6 months, or once a year. And this is often driven by funding or requirements for our research project or grant requirements that we have to do these at these set intervals. And SAMHSA actually, I talked about the first session, the fidelity kits, the SAMHSA fidelity kits, and they suggest that new programs do this kind of every 6 months, looking at their stuff. And then as the program kind of progresses, kind of tapering off, doing it less frequently. And the idea there is that there's more things to kind of iron out in the beginning. And, as you're going forward, hopefully things are running a little bit more smoothly and there's kind of less things to check on and change. Okay, so I'm just going to take a minute to pause here and just check in with everyone, see how everyone's doing. Wondering what people's experiences are with evaluations or program reporting. Does some of this stuff resonate or sound familiar? Or is it kind of a new idea to do a little bit of a deeper dive than just kind of sending out those reports that we always have to do?
I think you made a great comment about making sure, like when you're doing, especially your end of projects reports, you're thinking about the audience that you're writing them for. And those are great. But if that's all we're doing, you know, like you said, we're not really doing that deeper dive where we're really critically looking at outcomes and efficiency and everything else. We're just, you know, doing the, yeah, you gave us the money and we did a great job with it. Yay. And that's like, we have to do that, right? And that's fine, but that should not be the end of the story. That's only kind of the starting point.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we do that because we have to, right? But I think you bring up a good point. I think, we'll bring up some ideas today also of like the importance of doing it and what we're trying to get out of it, right? Like I think especially doing internal stuff and kind of disseminating that information and hey, this is how our project's going, kind of nails home when you have to give either good or bad feedback to staff, right? Like showing them this is what our outcomes are and this is kind of where we need to be. I think it can be kind of a powerful tool when you're doing that stuff internally. But yeah, I think that's a good point. I see a comment in the chat. At my work, we usually evaluate at the end of the project or activity, but I think evaluating process should be implemented too also. Do you mean like making sure that it's part of the process and kind of mandatory to go through that stuff? And yes, for sure, you can waste a lot of time and money if you get to this point and you did not, and you wait until the end to kind of look at this stuff. Yeah, that can definitely be a challenge. So I'm just gonna keep us moving. And again, if you have stuff, put in the chat, or we'll get to it, or feel free to unmute and ask whatever questions you come up. Okay, so some key ideas I think for evaluations too is to think about doing things in a repeatable way. Try to look at similar data with matching timeframes. That might be a little bit easier said than done, but looking at things on, whether you do it monthly, bi-monthly, yearly, whatever you determine is needed. And I think what's feasible too, right? I mean, you don't want to overburden your team with constantly having to check the data and whether or not services are being delivered, or looking at things on a monthly basis can be burdensome. I worked at one program and they were doing things on a monthly basis. And for a period, I think we really needed to do it that way, but it just wasn't kind of really sustainable to expect that to be done monthly. So, just thinking about what's needed and what, is manageable for the team to kind of look at how often to look at the data. But I think it's important to look at kind of the similar intervals. It makes it a little bit easier to compare kind of outcomes and what you're looking at with the data. So just an example, right? If we're looking at the number of clients served, if we're doing a similar time frame, it's easier to kind of pace ourselves and kind of just look at it and say, hey, are we on the same pace? Are we recruiting more participants? Or recruiting less participants? And if you do it on a monthly basis, it's a little bit easier. It's a little bit more difficult if you're doing it on different time frames. So if you're looking at it on 1 month versus a 3-month thing, then you got to break it down to determine kind of what pace you're on. And I think, a number of clients served is an easier metric to kind of break down, but depending on what the outcome is, it might be more challenging to kind of do that stuff. And then I think for people that are doing research studies too, we did all our study and analysis and, we want to report on our project, but we want to try to report on our project so other either research studies or other programs can come kind of replicate what was happening, which is, kind of a key part of, doing research. And then I think a last kind of important thing that I experienced was trying to have more than one person that knows where and what data is kind of used for the evaluation. I work with one program and their data person would always say, if I won the lottery and I left, are people actually going to be able to come back and figure out what the heck I was doing? Are people going to know where to find this data? Are people going to know how to use the data? And she did a really good job. She had some how-to lists and some walkthrough guides of what to access, kind of how to access it, and who to talk to for certain information. So I think that's just, a really good kind of practice to implement, right? Having more than one person kind of know what you're looking at and kind of how to get there. Okay, so what actually are we evaluating? We talked about when to evaluate and thinking about a little bit. And I think there could be multiple ways to think about kind of, what are we evaluating? But I kind of like the idea of having a data evaluation and also an impact evaluation. So a data evaluation is kind of pretty straightforward, right? It's what data we collect. And this data can be from a lot of different places. I think we talked about this in maybe our first session. We talked about data could be in our EHR, it could be on paper surveys, it could be client notes. For some grants, they have an online system that has client data in a totally different spot from our EHR, right? So kind of figuring out how you're going to get all that information and integrate it to be usable. And you don't want to get to this point and not be sure that you either if you collected the correct data, or you don't know where the data is being collected, you don't know where it's being stored. And I just want to bring up this chart again from our first session, because I think that this was a really good way to kind of think about things in our planning stage, thinking about what our goals are and what our objectives, and then trying to have a plan before you kind of go into it, where that data is going to be, and how you're going to get to it. So I think that this chart is helpful. So I just wanted to bring this back up as a reminder. And then examining our outcomes, right? Matching our data to our original goal. Then I also like the idea of evaluating our impact. So what's our impact on the clients and the larger community? Ultimately, did our clients benefit from our program? And in thinking about a research study, will future clients kind of benefit from these findings? Or will other research studies be able to kind of pick up and add to what you found? And this stuff is partially informed by data, of course, right? It overlaps a little bit, right? Things like, are clients being housed, or are they maintaining housing? Are clients becoming employed or returning to school? Right? Those are kind of data informed questions. But I think it might also be informed by some like other data points. And this information may or may not be required by funders, or may not be required to report on it. But I think it's still important to consider for ourselves, either internally, or if we're doing, reports, to try to include some of this stuff, as it can really help paint kind of an important picture of the impact we're having on our clients, community, stakeholders, things like that. And of course, at the end of the day, the goal is to improve, our clients' lives and through the services that we're providing. So some of these things might be client satisfaction, right? What do clients think about our programs? It might include things like client testimonials. It might also be things that are somewhat attached to our goals, but are maybe a little bit further, right? If you're doing a supported housing service, the funders might ask you questions like, are people being housed? Are they remaining housed? But additionally, right, are clients learning ADLs, right? They're learning activities, data living skills, things like that. Right, so that might be questions that they're not asking, but important for us to think about, and can definitely help increase our reports that we have to provide. And also things like, have we partnered with other programs, clients linked to food banks or primary care providers, things like that. And I just wanted to also bring up that in the SAMHSA fidelity kits, they actually kind of highlight these two different areas, right? The data and the impact. So a lot of the fidelity kits have a data aspect, right, in that fidelity assessment where they really talk about data outcomes. And this example was the supported housing example. So they're asking about, do tenants be able to choose the type of housing they're interested in? Are they able to choose from multiple units? Right, so those are very data-driven aspects. Whereas they also ask about the impact in this global organizational index. So a lot of the information comes from staff and client interviews. In this example, it's asking about using quality questionnaires. So really more about the impact and getting kind of a fuller picture, trying to tie those two things back together, right? The data and the impact of our program. We're talking about evaluating it. And just to tie all this back to our evaluation and kind of how the process might look, right? So after reviewing our outcomes, we have our data outcomes and our impact outcomes. And we're trying to disseminate those integrate those as best we can as we're evaluating things and looking at the data and thinking about what's going on. You know, we're trying to critically evaluate what we've done. And, you know, I like to, think about it as like a discussion section of a research article. Right in our results section, we're talking about what the findings are. Right, here's the data, kind of the idea of like, this is what we're sending out when we have to do those reports and funding. But when you think about like a discussion section of a research article, you know, you kind of take it the next step. You talk about what do those findings actually mean, and you try to make some interpretations of what's going on. You know, what did our program do good, and what were some of our limitations? What might be our future next steps? Right, which is just a little which is kind of taking the findings and bringing them to the next step. Which would be the next part, which is disseminating the information that we kind of come about all this, right? We do all this evaluation, we look at everything, right? And then we have to try to disseminate it out, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. But when we're disseminating our information, we want to try to be kind of objective and as transparent with ourselves as possible. You know, I think if we're trying to put a spin on it and, you know, trying to kind of paint things in a different narrative, you know, I think it's only a disservice to our clients and kind of ourselves, right? It's hard to improve if we're not really being kind of as objective with ourselves as we can. And again, when we're disseminating out, you know, it might look different for internal versus external slightly, but, you know, just trying to be as kind of clear as we can with ourselves. Okay, I'm just going to take another break. I know I threw a lot of information out, so just kind of checking in what everyone's thoughts are so far. And if this kind of looks similar or different to kind of what you've experienced or done in the past. And again, thumbs up and smiley faces are helpful as well, just to see if everyone's still doing good with us and hanging in there. All right, great. Seems some thumbs up. Appreciate that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about disseminating our findings. So we've done all this work, right? Who should hear about our amazing results of our program? So there's a couple different different areas that we might look at. Just seeing some stuff in the chat. So Yvonne says, this looks a little bit like what I've done in the past to evaluate their past projects. So great. I'm glad that it's, you know, just kind of echoing what you've kind of done in the past. I appreciate the participation and using the chat. Thank you. So there's a couple of different areas or kind of groups of people that we might want to tell about our amazing findings. Might include the staff in our agency, some stakeholders that have made investments in our project. Of course, submitting to our funders, and also possibly thinking about submitting for publications. So for our staff and agency, I think sometimes this gets lost in the shuffle, trying to provide some of kind of our findings and, reinforcing kind of the work they've done. And I think that this part's super important, especially because we want to celebrate wins that our staff are doing, and celebrating kind of all the positive things they're doing, right? Complimenting them. It helps them feel more invested in the program. Obviously, it's always helpful to hear, that you're doing a good job, and I think including them in the program, and it's also helpful if we have to give negative feedback, right? If we're doing negative feedback, we want to make sure we're doing our feedback sandwiches, right? We want to give positive stuff, negative stuff, and then positive again. But I think ultimately just keeping our staff in the loop of the program, here's the results. It opens up opportunities for them to ask questions, or kind of see what their hard work has kind of gotten to. And I think also community and stakeholders, right, offering information about the program might help keep them engaged. And in a way, I've kind of seen it help reduce stigma for our programs. We have NIMBY challenges, but if you can show that your program is being effective and helpful, it might be able to build trust. And one program in particular that I'm thinking about is the CITI trainings, if anyone's familiar with those. Those trainings focus on training police officers on how to kind of better intervene in situations where they're on mental health calls. And in some programs that they're piloting, actually having counselors go out the police unit on calls like that. So where it's been effective, I think, including the police officers and their departments, and kind of showing how effective it's been, talking about, hey, it reduces the number of incidents, and, had some positive outcomes for police officers, and also for people that they're responding to the calls for, reducing any, just reducing incidents and negative outcomes. It highlights how this might help police officers, and ultimately it kind of helps them continue such a program, which is great because those programs kind of help keep people out of the ER, keeping them out of being detained for different reasons. But again, I think including them and giving them some outcomes that are related to this programs, can be helpful. Of course, we have to share our findings with our funders, right? Sharing the highlights of the program, being transparent about our shortcomings. And in my experience, when you have to report for those grants, especially if it's like a multi-year grant where you're doing those kind of yearly reports or whatever the intervals might be. But when reporting those kind of areas in need, being transparent, isn't a total negative thing, right? As long as you kind of include an improvement plan, acknowledging the issues that it kind of came up, and they just kind of really want to show that you kind of thought through, what was going on, and kind of having an improvement plan, and how you're going to kind of tackle that and improve whatever that kind of area of need is. So again, sharing the highlights and being transparent about any shortcomings that the program had. And then we might also think about submitting for publication. So not just for if it's a research project, but I think also a community project as well, or if it's a pilot program, or if it's a program with kind of some unique characteristics. I think those are always helpful, especially for people kind of coming from behind you and trying to implement a similar program or may have similar challenges. I've seen lots of papers published on challenges and success papers, or implementing a new project. But I think it's just something to keep in mind, whether it's a research project or a community project, of trying to disseminate out some things that went good or went bad on your project. Sometimes those things are helpful for everyone to kind of hear about. All right, so what now? We kind of planned and implemented a project. We evaluated our data. We disseminated some of that information out to our, key group staff, stakeholders, or funders. And now it's really time to think about trying to make a sustainability plan and, what's our next steps for our project. And I think there's really a few different scenarios here, and I think they're all slightly different. So I think the first one is if it's a continuing project or continuing grant. Maybe we have a pilot program that now received kind of full go or additional funding. Again, maybe we have one of those multi-year grants that's continuing. Or maybe this is just kind of an existing program where we kind of did this whole process is just a improvement process. So really what we want to do is, incorporate all the lessons we learned thinking about our data, feedback from our staff and clients, observations we've kind of made, and really take some of our knowledge of our program's impact. And if we go back to that PDSA cycle, the idea is that you go through the planning stage, the study stage, the doing and acting, and then you kind of take all that information and everything you learned, and then you kind of roll it into the next stage, which would be just kind of starting right back at the planning stage again. And the idea is that now we kind of learned all this stuff, we made some smaller changes, and now we're kind of thinking about, is there any larger changes that we want to tackle? Is there any other ways that we can kind of improve our project? Is there any other larger kind of things that we kind of put off that we want to now tackle? So again, taking everything we learned and then kind of putting it into our next phase, our next PDSA cycle. I think the second scenario is for an expiring grant, which is kind of an unfortunate aspect of grants. You do all this work, and then you get to the end of the grant cycle, and the project kind of comes to an end. And I think when you're in this scenario, that's when you have a lot of those difficult decisions. What are we going to do with all the staff that we have hired? What are we going to do with the clients in our program? How are we going to kind of move them around, and what's kind of the idea for that? And I think ideally we want to try to start planning this process kind of prior to the end of our project or end of the funding. Thinking about how we can move staff to other positions. Is there other project areas or other areas of need at our agency where we can kind of shift those people? And then thinking about our clients, can we kind of graduate those clients to other services, either at our agency or is there other community programs we can refer people to? And then I think there's a little bit of a middle ground between those two, and it's often some research projects which are often funded for kind of a shorter period of time. So again, some are funded for longer multi-year projects, and they'll have multiple projects within the larger grant. So kind of shifting staff between those different processes or focus areas as kind of time goes on. But again, at some point, the funding for that research project might end. And again, you're back to kind of thinking about what we can do with these staff and what's our next project idea. But I think for any of the scenarios or for any program, there's some overlap on kind of things to think about. And I think the first thing is to think about who's going to carry the torch, right? Who's going to kind of hold on to the results of our program? How is the program kind of being led forward, right? So in our kind of example, as we walk through all these, we had an implementation team. But as the process goes along, right, some of those people might kind of step away, right? Or they might not be as needed as much. And just in a project I'm working on, we're working with the county systems review committees to reduce wait times in the ERs. So we have a team from Rutgers that's meeting with each county in New Jersey to try to come up with some ideas on, working with each county for their reducing wait times in each county, because each county is a little bit different. But we're not like long term, so we're kind of there for a couple months, helping them kind of work through that processes. But then at some point we're gonna, leave and move on to the next county. So for each of those, we try to build those ideas of, hey, at some point we're gonna leave. You should start thinking about who's gonna take this over, who's gonna kind of pick up things when we leave and kind of take the process forward. So again, kind of trying to plan on who's going to take those responsibilities and carry the torch moving forward. But I think it's also helpful to have someone doing that and making sure we have our data and some ideas kind of written out. It's always good to have our results ready for new opportunities. So maybe there's new funding that comes up or new grants that maybe we use towards recreating our project, adding funding to an existing project, or maybe start a new project, totally from the ground up. And it's always helpful to have our outcomes and our data to kind of point to. Makes it easier for us to obtain grants when we have some evidence that we, implemented a program previously successfully. And also, if we have publications, we get to cite ourselves and, sound like we know what we're talking about. So it's can also be helpful part of getting some publications. Okay, so I'm just gonna do a quick check-in. This is kind of the end of what I had for our evaluation slides for today. So kind of before I try to do a little bit of wrap up of our whole series, just want to see if there's any questions about what we talked about for the evaluation piece. See some thumbs up in the chat. I really look for some really good resources to try to give everyone for the evaluation piece. I think the challenge is that programs are just so different that some of those generic evaluation forms, they're not overly helpful. I think that those forms that I gave you in the beginning, in the first session, had some good ideas about the evaluation. I think it's also helpful to go to kind of backtrack on what your planning stage was and revisiting kind of what you said you wanted to do and thinking about how you wanted to evaluate those and just trying to match up where you ended up with where you wanted to go from the beginning. Okay. Right, so I'm just going to kind of do a quick overview of what we kind of talked about in our three-part series, and then I'd like to kind of open it up for discussion for any other questions, or if there's anything people kind of wished I had covered or interested in anything that they felt that I could give some more information on. So overall, in the whole series, we talked about the importance of our planning stage, how good planning can help us our implementation and evaluation stages, and help build a solid foundation. Talked about the importance of our team, right, helping drive the project through all the different stages, and help keep the agency and stakeholders informed, kind of engage with our project. Talked about some ways to kind of collect some of the outcomes and work through some barriers that may arise. Thinking about our project critically when evaluating and disseminating information about our program. And then today we also talked about planning for what's next after our project, either continuing our program or if it's the end of our grant. So I just wanted to open it up and get your impressions on the whole project and the process. I know it was a lot of information through the 3 sessions. So I was just wondering if there was any ideas that kind of stuck with you or anything else you guys wanted to share. So again, feel free to use the chat, or if you like to unmute your mic, that's works for me too. well, not hearing any of the questions or thoughts, so hoping that the series overall was helpful for everybody and hope everybody got plenty of information out of it. I'm going to put my email in the chat, so if anyone has additional thoughts or ideas that kind of come up, afterwards or as you're going through the process, because all the information we covered is not just short-term thing. So, if you're going through a project or a process and, well, I'm sorry, just type that, feel free to reach out to me and, I might be able to give some more individualized informations on that stuff. So I'm seeing Yvonne says, I really like the series because everything was straight to the point. The idea that stuck with me was most lack of resources topic in session 2. Yeah, I think that's always a challenge. And I think sometimes we don't want to overpromise and underdeliver, right? So I think being realistic on what our resources are and, what we're capable of doing in our program and with the resources that we have, I think it's better for our staff, our program, our clients we're serving. And if you set those kind of realistic expectations, it's easier to, kind of hit those marks when you have to report on your grant. And, having a successful grant, as I kind of covered today, is, easier to get refunding or, seek new funding if you had successful outcomes or, being able to report on yourselves in a good way. All right, so if there's no other comments, I'm going to turn it over to Kati again to kind of bring us through our last slides of information. And again, I just want to thank everybody for their participation and sticking with me on these three sessions.
Thank you, Sean. And thank you everyone for your participation and your attendance today. Next slide, please. As a reminder, I know I previously mentioned we are funded through SAMHSA, and as part of receiving this funded, we are required to evaluate all of our products and training events and services. So before you leave us today, please hover over the QR code to access the short evaluation survey. And I also included the link in the chat if that's easier for you. I will email this link to all the participants today as well. Next slide, please. And I also wanted to remind you of our podcast channel, Toward Wellness and Recovery. And we currently are featuring Flourishing at Work, a plan for helping professionals. And you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, or Podbean. Next slide, please. And if you have missed any of our previous sessions in this series, along with any other webinar recordings or webinar topics that may interest you, we do have a catalog of posted products and resources. And to access this catalog, just hover over the QR code. It'll take you directly to the page on our website. Next slide, please. And as a reminder, everyone today will receive a certificate of completion. We just kindly ask that you allow 7 days for processing. Within those 7 days as well, you'll receive a link to our posted recording, as well as the slides that were shared today. Next slide, please. And again, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us. We hope that the information is useful in your line of work. I want to thank Sean also for providing the webinar for us. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Bye, everybody. Thanks, Kati.